Today's top story from the perspective of someone who's there.
You are looking live.
This just in.
Not my beat.
For more on this, we bring in really one of the experts of the experts on it, at least from the economic side of it. Andy Zimbalist has been writing about the intersection of sports and economics for 30 years, including how stadiums have affected sports, or sports stadiums have affected local economies, all of those types of things. He's a professor, he's a published author, and somehow he's wound up on a December afternoon on a sports radio show. Andy, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Good to be with you.
So to start, I would like to kind of define what we're talking about here when it comes to the, obviously the reason we're talking about this is we have a basketball and a hockey team moving out of the District of Columbia to Virginia. And the economic consensus is that stadiums are bad. Like, that's the very top line item. Stadiums are bad for economies. They don't actually provide the economic boost that is often promised by politicians. So how do you define that economic boost? What like, whose economy are we talking about here? A city budget versus what fans spend versus, obviously Ted Leonsis is doing it for a reason as the owner of these teams. He's got his own personal economy he's worried about. So when we talk about the economic side of it, what is the economy that we're talking about?
Well, really, we could do any one of those three things. We could look at its impact on fans, or the impact on Ted Leonsis and his teams, or the impact on DC and Alexandria. So all of those are game for analysis. I think when stadiums are getting built or arenas are getting built, I think the more common question that gets asked by the media is, what impact is it going to have economically on the city, either DC or Alexandria, or even the state of Virginia. Most of the economic analysis that's been done on that question does suggest, as you had indicated, that there's not much gain to be made by having a new team or a new facility in your area. I think, even though that's the basic conclusion in the general case, that there have been some cases where there's a lot of private financing and where there are certain synergies between the development program and the city's needs, it's possible that you could have positive budgetary impact whereby the city budget will generate more revenue than it will generate costs. It's possible, but it's not typical. And so I think the sagest advice one could give to a city is to be extremely cautious and careful as you put down your assumptions and your numbers, and make sure that when you're lining up presumed investments from developers, that you've lined them up with a contract rather than simply a letter of agreement or a memorandum of understanding.
I was actually reading earlier today out of the Washington Post archives when the MCI Center, as it was called at the time, opened in the early 2000s, and how Abe Pollin put $200 million of his own money. There was about $60 million in public funds. Is that looked at as one of those potential success stories, the origin of this building that is now Capital One Arena, and how it changed DC is one that can work if there's the right amount of private investment?
It's conceivable that you could make that argument for the old MCI Center. In addition to Abe putting up a larger share of money than is typical, he also accepted lease terms which were unfavorable to his team. And this is something that Leonsis has been complaining about for years. He doesn't really have a right to complain about it, by the way, because when he bought, well, it was back, I think it was still the Bullets when he bought it. What's now the Wizards, when he bought it, those unfavorable lease terms, and Leonsis says it cost him $36 million a year. I'm not sure that's the right number, but he's paying a lot of money to stay in that stadium or that arena. Those unfavorable arena terms impacted the price that he was paying for the team. So he paid a lot lower price than he otherwise would have. If he had the deal that he says everybody else has, where they're paying $3 or $4 million a year for their arena, then he would have had to pay more for his team. So he's already benefited from a lower price, and now he wants both the lower price and the lease terms that he says other teams have. So in this case, and at this point, I think it's very hard to make an economic assessment of the economic impact, because they simply haven't released very much information. They're making the claim that the additional financial obligations that the city is taking on and the state is taking on, they're making the claim that those obligations will be covered by additional revenue that will be generated by the activity, but they haven't said what assumptions they're making. They haven't given us any details whatsoever. And we know from other cases that these mixed public-private partnerships have a lot of question marks. So, for instance, they're talking about a special tax zone. Special tax zone is one where you designate a certain geographic area, and then you say any additional tax revenues taken from that area will go to finance the debt service on the bonds that were issued in order to finance the construction. The problem with that, or the problem that there may be with that, is that some of the new activity that comes to this zone might be activity that moved from elsewhere in Alexandria or from elsewhere in Virginia. And so other parts of the city are going to be generating less tax revenue, even though the special tax zone will generate more. But what the city cares about is its overall resources, and the resources might not increase in that case. They go down in part A of the city, but they go up in part B. What's the net? So we have to know a lot more to be able to assess something like that.
That leads to kind of one of the big questions, I think, specific to these teams moving, and also when we're talking about the Commander Stadium, as we're joined by Andy Zimbalist, Economist author, with us here on the Hoffman Show. How different is the calculation for the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia? Because unlike when the 49ers move from San Francisco to Santa Clara, or the Warriors move from Oakland to San Francisco, they're still within the state of California. Going from the District of Columbia to Maryland, does that change the calculus for the jurisdictions involved?
Sure, it changes it somewhat. It's probably not the case that every dollar that was spent in DC on the Wizards and the Capitals, not every one of those dollars will now leave DC and go to Virginia, but a large share of them will. So for instance, if I'm a basketball fan, but I'm not a rabid basketball fan, and on Friday afternoons Friday evenings I like to take my son to a Wizards game. And now, because the Wizards aren't there anymore, but I live close to that area in Northwest DC, and I want to do something with my son that night. Maybe I'll take him to a bowling alley. Maybe I'll take him out to dinner. Maybe I'll take him to a movie theater. So I don't necessarily take the $200 I would have spent at a Wizards game and then move that and spend it in Virginia. I might spend it on other entertainment venues in DC. So so we don't know a priori or beforehand. We don't know how many people would behave like me in that example. So what percent of the money will be relocated to other entertainment venues within DC, as opposed to the same people who went to see the Wizards in DC are not going to go to Alexandria? We don't know the answer to that. It's probable that the answer is that a large chunk of those dollars will be lost by DC, and they will go to Alexandria, Virginia.
So one of the things that you've written about, that I've seen others in this space write about as well, is the opportunity cost, which is also impossible to measure. But sometimes we get to see an example like Turner Field in Atlanta. It gets moved on from in a very controversial way to Cobb County, northern suburban Atlanta. And all of a sudden, the area around Turner Field that was kind of a nothing outside of the games is revitalized in a way where there's housing and supermarkets and all those kinds of things. So if you look at what that space in DC could become, like what are the alternate options if there's not going to be an arena there, and how does like the budgets in terms of some of the other things that people bring up with DC, education, et cetera, how are those things all intertwined? What could happen? And how the budget allows for those things to move.
Well, Leonsis owns the arena, as I understand it, and he's
although he does, so he has a land lease on it, but owns the space above ground.
Yeah, right.
Right.
And he has articulated a plan that he has to bring the WNBA Mystics to the arena. And he says he has some other thoughts about other events too, so that he could still have 200, 220, some similar number of events there a year. And it could still be serving a pretty functional purpose, even if it generates say $5 million less in city ticket tax revenue, which is, I think, roughly what would happen. It's not an enormous loss for Washington for this to happen. It's a loss, but not an enormous loss. So it depends upon how much energy and resources Leonsis is willing to put into finding alternative programming for the DC arena. If Leonsis concludes after several years of trying to have alternate programming that it's not paying off, and then it's hard to imagine that arena being repurposed for some other economically viable purpose, and more likely that land or urban real estate in downtown DC is very, very valuable, and you'd have to find some better use of that land, and that would probably entail knocking down the arena.
Have you seen a difference in suburban arenas and the economic impact versus urban?
There aren't that many modern suburban arenas. The era of the suburban arena was the 60s and the 1960s and 1970s. Since 1992, when Camden Yards was built, and Larry Lucchino showed us a model that basically said if you put your sports facility next to the downtown business community, that you'll be able to attract this new type of clientele, which is basically business people who work until 5:30. At the end of the day, they if the stadium is walkable distance or nearby, they walk with their colleagues to the stadium. They go to a restaurant or a bar in the stadium. They have some drinks. They eat some delicious food, and then they stay and watch the game. That's a model that Lucchino basically brought to the sports world, that everybody has followed since 1992, and it's been a very productive model. Now, if what happens is that as a result of the emergence and the rapid growth of remote work, people aren't going into the office anymore, or say half the people that used to go to downtown offices aren't going anymore, then that model becomes vitiated. It's a weaker model than it used to be. Now, if that happens at the same time, and this is one of the things you raised, the Cobb County case with the Braves. Mm-hmm. One of the things that tends to be true about suburban land is it's further away from concentrations of residential areas, and it's further away from business concentrations. And so the land tends to be less expensive than center city land. And so if you combine the possible effect of remote work with cheaper land, it might be the case, again, as what happened in Cobb County, it might be the case that we get a reversal. And the trend that started to happen in the 80s and 90s of central city construction might start to reverse itself, or at least present a more mixed picture.
Andy Zimbalist, he's an economist, an author, a professor, with us here on the Hoffman Show for another minute or two. And really the last kind of topic I want to touch on with you, Andy, is the non-monetary impact of this. And I'm sure, the nature of an economist is you're always trying to put a number on something, because that's, otherwise you can't quantify it. That's the point. But when you go to a movie theater, for instance, I've used this analogy a couple of times today. If you go to a movie theater, you don't expect a return on your investment. You expect to go see a good movie. So the idea that going to a sporting event would cost something is fine, even if you pay some of that in taxes or however we pay that as citizens. So is there a way to measure kind of the social impact of this, of a basketball team that is beloved in a city, and also the hockey team, but specifically to the District of Columbia, the basketball team leaving, and kind of the emotional gut punch of that? How do you try to quantify that, if you try to quantify that?
Yeah, well, that's a complicated question, and I'd be happy to talk about it for the next 2 or 3 hours.
Great. All right. So this is now the Andy Zimbalist show.
Right. If you raise the question of going to a movie, and let's say that it costs $10 to go to a movie where you're living. Well, then you can't quantify it. You know that the value that I receive for going to the movie when I buy a $10 ticket is at least $10. I might get some surplus. Maybe I get 14 dollars of pleasure
Yeah,
out
you
of
love
it.
the movie, right?
But I know that maybe I'm anticipating at least a $10 return. There is a methodology that's used. I'm not crazy about it. It's called contingent valuation methodology. And basically what it is a fancy survey technique where you go and you ask people, how much money would you be willing, how many additional dollars of tax would you be willing to pay if you could keep the Wizards in DC? And on the basis of a survey like that, you can generate some estimates of what the psychic or community value is. But I think, as your question suggested, I think in reality, what's going on with a sports team, at least has historically gone on with sports teams, is that it helps create community. It's something that brings the community together. You could talk about it over the water cooler at work. You could be at a stadium and the center fielder on your team hits a home run in the bottom of the ninth and you win, and you turn to the guy or the woman next to you and you high five them even though you never saw them before in your life. Why is that? Because you're all rooting for the same team. You're all part of the community. And even though it might not be the most profound expression of community that you can imagine, it's something that's gratifying and fun to be part of a community like that. And so, yes, those elements of value are certainly there from a sports team. And I think those same elements of value justify to some degree some public support for stadium building. What's unfortunate is that we're in a situation, and it's exemplified now with Virginia and DC. We're in a situation where there's open competition between two cities to retain a sports team. And why did the sports teams or Ted Leonsis get to have that happen? Because in the NHL and the NBA, they're monopolies and they restrict output in order to get better value for their output, higher prices. And this is what Leonsis is benefiting from here. And this is what other owners throughout the professional sports have benefited from historically.
Yeah. Man, there's so many other things that I would love to talk. We could go talking about this stuff for hours. Leonsis just got a bunch of money from the Qataris, and then he's asking public money. And then there's, the larger economic forces at play, pandemic adjacent and not, just kind of trends of different things since the 70s, really, in terms of, the billionaire class versus the rest of us trying to buy tickets. But perhaps we'll save those for another day. Andy, this was so insightful. Thank you so much for your time. It's greatly appreciated.
You want to talk about Ohtani's contract?
I would love to talk about Ohtani's contract. That honestly, that was what I was planning on doing in part today is like, hey, are we still cool just going to baseball games, rooting for guys making $70 million? And must it be nice to be able to defer $68 million a year down the road because you're making so much?
What's important to understand, and not many sports journalists have really understood this, is when you take the present value of what he's getting paid, we're $68 million a year for the last 10 years after he's done playing, deferred money. If you take the present value of that, it turns out to be something on the order of $37 million a year, or a total of $370 million. So they're talking about this, record-breaking contract, which it is in nominal terms, but because it's spread so far into the future, the current value of it is actually below the value that Trout got or the value that Judge got.
I know there's also tax implications.
It's an awful lot of money, to be sure.
Yeah.
It's an awful lot of money. But not only does that situation lower the actual value of it, but it's also the case that it helps the Dodgers a great deal because they won't have to pay as much luxury tax. So there's a lot of kind of economic fine points that are behind this that I don't think have been fully assessed yet and understood.
Well, I also know that he can kind of fuddle with the taxes as well, because if he is retired at that point, which you'd presume he would be based on his
that's a misapprehension. That's not true.
So he still gets
states charge taxes on money that's earned in the state. It doesn't matter if you get paid the next year or not. If you earn the money while you're playing in the state, and he'll play 81 games a year at Dodger Stadium. He'll play about 7 or 8 or 9 games a year in San Francisco. He'll play the same amount in San Diego, and so he'll end up getting about maybe 65% of his money from playing in California. He'll have to pay California high income taxes, which are 13.3%. But he'll have to pay them whether he gets that money in 2024 or 2034 or 2042. Whether he's living in Tokyo or he's living in Miami or he's living in Los Angeles, he's got to pay them anyway because the money was earned while he was playing in Los Angeles.
Gotcha. So the jock tax can't escape it, is what we've learned.
It's not easy. Maybe they're going to try a new technique, but it's unlikely that that Newsom and his colleagues will allow that to happen.
There you go. Learned something else that we didn't even plan on. Thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Talk to you. My pleasure.
What's up, kiddos? It's your boy Clinton Yates from ESPN. It's the Hoffman Show on the Team 980. Tell your mama I said what's up.